So a little bit of a change of tack now from whistleblowing onto hacking and internet activism. I'm delighted to be able to present Gabriella Coleman, who's an anthropologist working at the intersection of the cultures of hacking and politics. She's going to be talking to you about Anonymous and the hacking movement.
Hello, everyone. Let me just see here. OK, I'm going to just dive in. All right, as many people know, probably here today, computer hackers have become a major geopolitical force in the world. They build anonymity tools such as Tor. They hack and leak information to the press, as Anonymous once did prolifically. They've changed the technological conditions of journalism in many ways, for example, by building tools such as SecureDrop. And they continue to aid in social movements, for example, helping to expose the far right by infiltrating forums such as Discord and taking the logs and giving it to journalists. So as an anthropologist who has written about computer hackers for over 20 years, one of my key interests concerns what even compels computer hackers to act politically in the first place. Many of them have economic privileges, and they could choose not to engage in direct action. Another very interesting question concerns whether hackers and their actions are perceived as legitimate or illegitimate in the public sphere. So one anonymous activist once tweeted a very powerful tweet that became quite famous. And it's a tweet that starts to get at this issue about whether hackers are seen as legitimate or illegitimate. And it's this tweet: "You cannot arrest an idea," he tweeted. This was Jake Davis, also known as Topiary, and he tweeted this before he got arrested. So you can't, literally put an idea in jail, but you could sure as heck halt, stop, bring to an end, check, block, hinder, hamper, delay, restrict, limit, interrupt, prevent, inhibit, impede, interfere with, thwart, curb, and put a brake on a movement. An idea, a whole category of person. You can arrest hackers and put them in jail. And our next panel, our panelists will be talking about the criminalization of hacking. But just as powerful concerns labeling activists such as hackers as terrorists. That is the way you arrest ideas in social movements. And I actually think that Anonymous was very well placed to be framed as cyber terrorists. There was numerous attempts to do so, and they evaded that designation. But they didn't evade it deliberately. They evade it for many, many contingent reasons. And today, I'm going to talk about that evasion, especially one set of reasons related to the Guy Fawkes mask. And I think it's an interesting story because it is about the power of ideas and symbols. It is about the power of perception in the ways that we see actors such as activists or journalists as legitimate. So before I go into, again, one set of reasons out of many about how Anonymous evaded this, I'd like to first give a little bit of a sense of the ways in which the government tried to frame Anonymous as cyber terrorists. So let me give you one example from February 21st, 2012, because I'm going to return to this example at the end of the talk. On this day, the Wall Street Journal reported that Keith Alexander, who was then the head of the NSA, had briefed officials at the White House in a secret meeting. Alexander claimed Anonymous could have the ability within the next year or two to bring about a limited power outage through a cyber attack, even without using the T word. And in other instances, the terrorism word was slapped on to Anonymous. General Alexander's claim was meant to portray Anonymous as a grave menace, akin to jihadists just in the cyber realm. It was the most vigorous journalistic attempt to frame Anonymous as at root nefarious. So why was it conceivable for government officials and others to kind of be successful when they made these designations? Well, very quickly, for decades, the cyber warfare pump had been primed. There had been many sort of claims that one day we were going to see a major attack against critical infrastructure, and Anonymous, if people believed they were going to attack it, could be slotted in that frame. Another, really important part is the state in various capacities had labeled quite successfully certain activists as terrorists. Probably the animal rights movement is the most pertinent example of this, and Will Potter's book really lays this out in great detail, and he argues that the saboteur in particular was reframed as the terrorist. Another reason why I think they could have been framed in this capacity is that they engaged in really high-risk hacking. They were hacking NATO, for example. During one summer, they were telling the FBI to fuck off every week. And then also, crucial to this story is that a class of hackers in Anonymous did engage in computer sabotage. Along with taking emails and giving it to journalists, there were also a couple of instances of Anonymous hackers breaking into 2 companies, taking the emails, and deleting all the files as well. So I think these are some of the reasons why, even though I don't think they're terrorists, they were in a position where that framing could have taken off. So now let me turn to Guy Fawkes. And it's a mask, an icon, and a symbol that became synonymous with Anonymous. And it's interesting it became synonymous with Anonymous because actually Anonymous took on the mask for contingent reasons that I don't have time to get into. But they took on the mask. And the very obvious part of my story in terms of how the Guy Fawkes helped inoculate Anonymous against the charge of terrorism is that today, Guy Fawkes, at least in certain quarters of the population, is seen as a kind of cool revolutionary figure, a dude to admire. And we have Alan Moore and David Lloyd's graphic novel and the subsequent Hollywood film based on the novel to thank for these associations. But what I find interesting, again, as someone who is interested in the powers of symbols and perception, is that this is a remarkable symbolic achievement, given the centuries of state-led propaganda that tried to fix the meaning of the gunpowder plot of 1605 as tyranny in its purest form. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. But what's really remarkable is this really only represents the apex of that transformation. The radical reinvention of Guy Fawkes actually started much earlier in the 1700s, when it was no longer polite to be critical of Catholics and polite society. There was a law that was passed in 1829, the Acts for the Relief of His Majesty's Roman Catholic Subjects in Ireland, that also made it extra improper to be critical of Catholics. Guy Fawkes was Catholic. So all of a sudden, he was understood in a slightly different way. But this law was quite unpopular, and it was only a little bit later in the 1850s when people started to write children's books and historical novels where Guy Fawkes really started to change as a figure and an icon. He went from a marginal but vilified historical figure to fictionalized character, a politically motivated sympathizer with a common people's cause. And so this is really when you start to have a dissociation of someone who was kind of understood as a terrorist, and he was reframed symbolically as someone to admire. And then that kind of set of associations was sort of finished off 100 years later with V for Vendetta. What's interesting, though, is you have fiction imitating history, and then what you have with Anonymous, and even before Anonymous, is that the mask starts to take on a life on the streets again. And that kind of association between radical politics and Guy Fawkes really continues precisely because you leave the realm of fiction into the realm of reality. All right. Another kind of interesting part of this story, now we're going to the present, is that it was not simply that, Anonymous used the mask. It was not simply that the mask was used in on the streets, but then other creative types started to use Anonymous and the mask in their TV shows, such as Mr. Robot, The Good Wife, and films like Who Am I? And this helped to kind of cement this positive association. By contrast, animal rights activists, I've kind of seen almost every film, they tend to get a very bad rap in popular culture. But if you have to follow the mask and the Guy Fawkes mask and why it helped inoculate Anonymous from these charges of terrorism, I'm going to highlight the importance of one event. And this was in Poland in 2012, where the government was considering a treaty around copyright, the Anti-Counterfeit Trade Agreement. So it was late January 2012. It looked like the Polish government was going to support the treaty, and a lot of people on the streets were protesting this, and Anonymous got involved. And so they launched Operation Acta. Welcome to Operation Anti-Acta. We encourage you to spread the word of Anti-Acta far and wide. The top priority is to steal and leak any classified government information. So in the midst of this big attack against the Polish government websites, there was also big street protests. Something really remarkable happened on the day of the vote. And this was January 26, 2012. And this is what happened. Polish parliamentarians took on the mask in government chambers to protest Acta. And this was the first time in the history of this Guy Fawkes icon where the mask was taken up by government officials in government chambers. So a lot of people noted how remarkable this was. Anonymous activists talked about how this recast the way that their tactics were understood. But what I think is significant is also how difficult it became to demonize the Guy Fawkes mask after this moment. And yet this is exactly what happened. Remember that Wall Street Journal story? Maybe it won't come as a surprise when I tell you this. It was published 2 weeks after the Polish parliamentarians took the mask. It was published in the aftermath of this event. Now, of course, I can't prove that there was really any relationship between the two, but this story was one of the few stories, I read almost everything related to Anonymous, that really misportrayed what was going on in the ground. There was no indication that they ever wanted to attack critical infrastructure. In fact, a lot of security hackers who could not stand Anonymous really said this was bullshit. You know, we don't like Anonymous, they're really problematic, but there's no indication ever that they would want to do this or have the capability to do this. So I thought this, again, was a really interesting moment where it felt like, again, a very unsubstantiated story from the NSA was used to try to discredit at the moment that Anonymous, in certain respects, gained a certain type of credibility and legibility. So just to wrap up, what are the stakes of this story? Again, remember, this is one part of a much larger argument related to about 6 or 7 reasons concerning how they evaded this framing, right? This is just one little part, because I had very little time. But one of the key components here is that you don't need the framing of cyber terrorism to have a hacker crackdown. You will throw people in jail, right? And that is what we're going to hear about right now. But as the case of Lori Love shows, if you don't have public support, if you're arrested and there's an extradition request on you, that's going to hurt you. This really matters, because symbols and ideas really matter. You know, one of the big famous quotes that come from the alt-right is that politics is downstream from culture. And that's something that came from Andrew Breitbart. Steve Bannon really likes it. And I think for those of us who engage in political activism, it is really important to think about the power of symbols and ideas. Thank you very much.